Okay, this is feedback for KobutaNori. The original message is my main issue is that I'm not exactly sure how to approach referencing foliage. It looks clumpy and not leafy. I try to use a scatter brush. It's useful in the background but not so great in the mid and foreground. Any tips to approach this? And I also don't know how to approach long stringy bushy foliage versus clumpy shorter leaf bushes. And then the second question is how to approach texture with the stone arch. Mine feels smooth and not really know how to get that great hard rock texture from it like in the reference. So I will start with the stone arch. It looks smooth because what you chose to draw in your study is the levels, the planes of the surface rather than the texture of the surface. So you did this by drawing slight gradients in the form of like you used a big brush and then you used low contrast colors to give this kind of surface unevenness to it, which is fine. It is a necessary thing to draw if you want to draw realistically. But there are two levels of texture. One is the planes of the surface, right? And then the second one is the actual texture of the surface, which is which you're lacking. So if I zoom in a lot, it looks like static, but you can see it in the form of these lights. Okay, I'm gonna super exaggerate it and make it easy to see. Lights, lights, dark, 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 lights, dark, lights, dark. This kind of texture, and this is this shows a gritty texture because the light is the highlights naturally and the dark is the shadow cast by the protrusion of the tiny little bump that blocks the light from its below, and the sheer numerousness of all of this light and shadow, and then the big contrast between the light and shadow. So this is really bright and then this is really dark. This is a pretty strong contrast compared to say the rest of the difference between here and here, right? So it's these kind of texture that you're lacking. Generally, you don't want to draw too much of this because when you do too much, it becomes a texture of its own. It becomes static. Your eyes, when you're looking at it, is going to see it as noise. But just having something like this is enough to give that grit that you want. So I'm going to take the darkest shadows from what you've drawn, since these shadow points are also from almost the darkest shadows. So immediately what you see is, oh, okay, there are bumps on this rock surface. It's uneven. And then what's important is I used a hard brush at 100% so that these bumps have a sharp edge and a very defined shape, since that's what I perceive from the stone. Now, I'm not doing this across the entire block of stone. I could, because if I were to draw this single stone as a study, that's the amount of detail that is necessary. But if I do this for just this level of study, notice how this block kind of just gets lost. It starts looking like the background, right? And the more you hyper focus into this kind of aspect for everything, the less your picture is going to convey crucial information. So having something like this is enough. It's there, your brain will fill in the rest. It will probably think, okay, the rest of the stone is probably similar texture, and it provides a nice contrast from the rest of the texture on the rest of your canvas, which is super busy and full of detail, every single pixel on the screen. So just something like this is enough to give texture. In these studies, most of the time what you want is not to replicate the entire piece pixel by pixel or like inch by inch, but you're trying to notice what makes a certain thing look like, they look like. What is the way that they reflect light? Is it a cool light? Is it a strong light? How does the surface texture manifest? What is the way the planes of the surface, how does it bend? And usually when you find out answers to some of those questions, you only need to do it like once or twice, here or there, just like how when you draw a face, you don't draw every single pore on your face. Or if you're trying to draw somebody with freckles, you don't try to draw every single pore, every single spot on the freckles. You do a few, even in like, I don't know, 10, 20 little spots would be enough to convey the same message across, because your brain would be enough, it would be enough for your brain to see, oh, okay, the artist is trying to tell me that this person has freckles. And then in this case, oh, okay, the artist is trying to tell me that this rock, it has an uneven surface, that's why it has a soft gradient of blotches of big dark colors and big light colors, but it also has like gritty bumps to it such that the surface is not shaved down, right? So it has these little spots on it. So that's the stone arch. Now let's talk about the foliage. So I don't really draw foliage, so I don't have any good examples for it. I'm going to try my best to explain the concept behind drawing foliage as it works in my head. So the original question was, from my attempt, it looks very clumpy and not leaf-like. I tried to use a scattered brush. It's useful for the trees in the background, but not so great for the mid and foreground. So the problem with this approach, from what I've seen, is you've used a scatter brush from the beginning. You used it to draw everything. If I can make a comparison, this is like you trying to do a study of a person's face again, and you're trying to draw it by drawing every single pore, rather than, say, draw the big shapes of the face first, and then you draw in the big features, and then you draw in the details of the features. As different as landscape is to, say, drawing a person, I think the approach from general to specific is the same. This limits the amount of time you think about the detail, and you think a lot more about the general shapes. And then if you can recall the example that I gave for the stone, you give an impression of the texture, and that's enough for the brain to fill in the rest for you. It's not necessary to draw in every leaf. It's not necessary to make every block of leaves or bush or grass look exactly like they are. When we draw hair, we draw maybe a big strand and then like a few strings, and then we will know that the rest of the hair is just like that. So in this case, what you want to do when you're doing studies like this is to look at the piece and think about it in terms of its big shapes. Think of this as a low poly, shitty 3D model. If you only had, like, I don't know, 2 shapes to convey this whole block, you would probably draw it like this. It tells the story, right? One side is facing the sky, one side is not. One side is in shadows, one side is in highlights. Shadows, highlights. Shadows, highlights. Right? And then you try to, it's just like the same approach as you drawing a stone arch. And then you try to give it texture to tell people, okay, on this surface, what is the texture here? So something like this. And it's enough to show, okay, this is a bush, and it's the leaves shapes, like it's like this, and it's dense. That's it. You don't need to draw everything else. But that is a polished problem. So I wanted to mention this because the best way to draw these kind of studies is to lay down your foundation like this. So let's see, like, I'm just gonna eyedrop, but normally you wouldn't want to eyedrop. So like something like this, you lay down the background, and then you think, okay, this is the tree in the background. This is the kind of blocks that you're working with. And then the same kind of trees over here. Some dark branches, an arch. A lot of this bush is in shadows, but some of it is in highlights. So you're like drawing rocks or blobs, jelly beans. But you want to see this picture as this kind of big blocks of stuff, because it will convey the composition of what you're trying to draw across. It will allow you to decide lighting, so where the light is coming from, which parts are in shadows and which parts are in highlights. And then it will allow you to sort of think of what do I need then to further polish or detail or refine certain big shapes to be what they are, to convey what they are beyond just showing what they are by using through their colors and through their big shapes. This, after you've laid down the foundation for all of these blocks, then you can say use a leaf brush. I don't really have one. This one doesn't work very well, but this is when you can do something like this without feeling like you can't use this to, without feeling like you have to use this on every inch of the canvas. Like something like this, for example. And when you draw like this, it leads to you not feeling like you need to hold on. It leads to you not feeling like you need to define everything, and it also allows you to focus on which things to define. And that is the reason for that is because sometimes what you want to convey is isn't that everything is leaves. What you want to convey is this contrast line between the highlights and the shadow. And without using this kind of block-ish approach, everything you draw will be sort of like gradients, right? In the form of this scatter brush. A scatter brush is like a staticky airbrush, so there's no sharp edges, there's no clear definition between highlights and shadow. You ended up having to use a block brush over the bushes to draw in this this clear divide after the fact. But the irony of doing this after the fact is you are killing some of the textures that you are trying to add into the leaves to make it look like leaves. So reversing the procedure using a block brush or doing general brush strokes first before thinking about texture will help you achieve that. So in the case of these, maple leaves here, red leaves here, what you are trying to do is you see, I can see that you see these blocks of shadow that have these leaf shapes on it, but in using the leaf brush to draw everything, you fail to be able to capture the shape of the shadow, and then you also fail to be able to capture the standout highlighted leaves, which makes it so that your texture brush doesn't actually do anything for you. It does not provide detail, nor does it provide structure. The only thing about this approach is that it kind of limits you to draw this kind of polish. So like very blocky colors. But I believe once you have this kind of polish, it's a lot easier for you to add nuance to the blocks. So just like how you would take two colors, you put them next to each other and then you try to blend it out. Just like this, you can detail it out by using more nuances in the brush, opacity, that you can use different shades of green. You can add little branches here and there, or you can not. You can choose whichever parts to do this to. You can choose to do it to everything if you want. But the fact of the matter is, even if you didn't do this, or you left some of the parts of the image without this level of polish, it still conveys the base structure that you need to show the viewers what they're looking at and show yourself that you understand what you are looking at in the reference. So I would suggest this kind of approach for drawing from very general to more and more specific. Use a high opacity or like hard brush or something like that first, and establish all your structures, understand the highlights and shadows, understand the depth of where you're drawing the objects before you go in and use, say, texture brushes to add fine leaf details in the back. And then the last question is, don't know how to approach the long stringy bushy things versus the clumpy shorter leaf bushes. In this case, it's just two different texture brushes that you would be using. Since if you draw the painting this way, you're going to end up with like these clumps here. Let me see if I can go back to before I ruined it with a leaf brush. Like something like this. So, oops. So like, this is what you would be seeing. Right, and it's just a matter of difference between this and this. How you turn the green blobs into either green blobs with short tree kind of leaves texture to tell people that that's what they're looking at, or green blobs with long leaves. This is where you could use or create brushes for specific purposes. I don't know if you made your scatter brush. Let me try to see. It looks very fine. Like it looks, the leaves and the textures on it look finer. Like this looks to me like you're using a leaf brush, but they're so much finer than what's on here. And so they kind of look like fuzz. I would suggest making your own brush every time for these kind of leaf textures, because drawing a bush that's like this, same shapes of leaves in a bush would look like this, whereas on a tree that is more aggressive with its branches would look more like this. So this is a round shape. This is more like kind of jaggy, flat with a lot of space in between kind of shape. And using the same brush for everything kind of just makes all your trees the same trees. So I would suggest drawing your own, it's quite easy. You just draw one bush by hand, or in this case, you draw something like this by hand. There are certain brush dynamics. I think, I don't know if I know how to use it. Like such as color dynamic. I read this actually yesterday from Suzanne Haley. I don't know how to do this, but like you can add color dynamics, hue jitter, saturation jitter, and it will do this. So it will base its brushstroke on your color, in this case red, and it will adjust the hue variance, the brightness, saturation values based on how much % of the variance you allow. And this is really useful when you make a tree brush. Oops. Whoops. So, like just by doing this, it will add a lot of variance to your brush. So coupled with the shapes, the distinct shapes that you add to any brush that you make, it's pretty much going to give you a lot of texture, and then you don't need to overdo this. You don't need to put this on the entire canvas. Just let's say we do it here to this nice little bush that I made. Just some on the edge, here and there, right? It's enough to tell you what you're looking at. So I would suggest trying this kind of stuff out in order to draw different bushes, leaves, foliage. The more time you spend preparing these kind of brushes, the less time you're gonna spend trying to fix them afterwards, like what you're doing here with actual hands-on drawing, which defeats the purpose of using brushes to create these textures. So long story short, draw a solid foundation without consideration for stuff like texture first. Leaves is texture. And then add texture on afterwards, either in the form of hand drawing or with the help of specifically made foliage brushes. Don't overdo it. Don't feel the need to fill every nook and cranny. Be able to stop yourself and focus on the parts that stand out, that are in focus. For example, this part, this part, this part, this part. And if you really feel like you're doing something wrong by not drawing every nook and cranny, leave the piece at what you think is wrong, but you know it's right. You feel like it's wrong, but you know based on knowledge that it's right. And then come back to it later. Look at it 2 days later. You will see that with a fresh pair of eyes, you basically would have drawn everything that the eye wants to look at and not feel distracted by everything else that you didn't draw because the texture isn't there to steal attention. So I hope that helped.